The leaflet was 3 inches by 5 inches. Black ink on white paper. On one side, a map showing safe routes to Allied lines. On the other, a message in Japanese promising food, water, medical care, and dignity. It weighed less than a gram. It cost a fraction of a cent to print. And it was about to do what months of artillery bombardment could not. Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kuribayashi held one of these leaflets in his hand on the morning of June 14, 1945, inside his command bunker on Luzon. Around him, his staff officers examined similar pieces of paper that had been falling from American aircraft for 3 consecutive nights. Thousands of them, drifting down like snow across Japanese defensive positions in the Philippine highlands. One colonel laughed. They think we'll surrender because of paper? Do they not understand Bushido? Do they not know what it means to serve the emperor? Another officer crumpled his leaflet and tossed it aside. It's American desperation. They've lost so many men trying to break our lines that now they resort to this. Kuribayashi said nothing. He smoothed the leaflet flat on his desk and studied it carefully. The Japanese text was grammatically perfect. The map was accurate. The promises were specific. Whoever designed this understood not just the language but the psychology, the fear, the isolation, the hunger. He looked up at his officers. How many of these have been distributed to our forward positions? Estimates suggest between 40 and 60,000, sir. Kuribayashi nodded slowly. Then we should prepare for defections. The room went silent. One captain, younger than the others, spoke carefully. Sir, our men are loyal. They would never. They are starving, Kuribayashi interrupted. They are cut off from resupply. They watch their friends die of infected wounds because we have no medicine. They know this war is lost. He held up the leaflet. And now someone is offering them a way out that doesn't require them to take their own lives. Within 72 hours, 347 Japanese soldiers would walk out of the mountain fortifications with these leaflets held above their heads. Within 2 weeks, that number would climb to over 1,500. Entire platoons. Complete defensive positions. Some units surrendered en masse, led by their own junior officers. It was unprecedented. Impossible according to everything Allied commanders thought they knew about Japanese military culture. And it changed the entire strategic calculation for the final months of the Pacific War. This is the story of how words became weapons. How understanding became more powerful than explosives. And how the most effective way to defeat an enemy sometimes isn't to kill them, it's to give them permission to stop fighting. By mid-1945, the Pacific War had reached a brutal stalemate. American forces controlled most of the major islands, but Japanese defenders remained entrenched across the Philippines, Okinawa, and dozens of smaller positions. The pattern was grimly consistent. Japanese troops fought until death, rarely surrendered, and often launched suicidal counterattacks when their positions became untenable. The casualty rates were staggering on both sides. On Iwo Jima, of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured, most of them wounded and unconscious. On Okinawa, similar ratios. The Japanese military code emphasized death before dishonor. Surrender was considered shameful not just for the individual soldier but for his entire family. This cultural factor had been reinforced through years of military indoctrination. American strategists faced a terrible calculation. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands would require breaking through these same defensive mindsets, but on a vastly larger scale. Casualty projections ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million Allied soldiers killed or wounded. The Japanese casualties, both military and civilian, would be exponentially higher. Someone needed to find another way. That someone was Fabian Bowers, though his name appears in few history books. Before the war, Bowers had been a graduate student specializing in Japanese language and literature at Columbia University. He'd lived in Tokyo for 2 years, studying classical theater and poetry. He spoke Japanese fluently, not just the formal military dialect but the regional variations and colloquial expressions that revealed how people actually thought and felt. When war broke out, he was recruited into the Office of War Information's Psychological Warfare Branch. His job was to understand the enemy, not their tactics or equipment but their minds. What they believed, what they feared, what might make them choose life over death. Bowers spent months interviewing Japanese prisoners of war. This was delicate work. Many prisoners were deeply traumatized, ashamed of their survival, convinced their families would be dishonored. But gradually, through careful, respectful conversation, patterns emerged. Japanese soldiers weren't ideologically committed in the way Allied propaganda suggested. They were terrified. Terrified of their own officers, who would execute suspected deserters. Terrified of American troops, whom they'd been told would torture and mutilate prisoners. Terrified of returning home in dishonor, of the shame that would fall on their parents and siblings. But underneath that terror was something else: exhaustion. A desire for the war to end. A recognition that Japan was losing. And critically, a distinction between surrender, which meant betraying the emperor and bringing shame, and ceasing to fight because continued resistance was militarily impossible. That distinction became the foundation of the leaflet campaign. The first prototype leaflets were crude. Simple messages urging surrender, printed in formal Japanese, dropped over positions in the Marshall Islands in late 1944. They produced almost no results. A handful of soldiers used them as toilet paper. Most ignored them entirely. Bowers and his team realized they'd misunderstood the problem. Japanese soldiers didn't need to be convinced the war was lost. Most already knew that. They needed permission. A framework that allowed them to stop fighting without feeling they were betraying their duty. The revised leaflets were masterpieces of psychological engineering. Instead of demanding surrender, they presented it as a rational military decision. The text began not with appeals to self-preservation but with acknowledgement of honor. You have fought bravely. You have done your duty to the emperor and to Japan. This opening was crucial. It validated rather than challenged the soldiers' self-image. It wasn't "you are defeated," it was "you have proven your courage." The framing created space for what came next. Your position is now surrounded. Supplies cannot reach you. Reinforcements cannot arrive. Your commanding officers know this. The emperor knows this. Further resistance cannot change the outcome, but it will result in your death and the deaths of your comrades. Notice the structure. You are not weak for considering this option. You are making a rational assessment of military reality. Your death will achieve nothing. This isn't cowardice, it's realism. Then came the practical information. Maps showing safe routes to Allied lines. Times when those routes would be uncontested. Specific instructions. Approach with hands raised, carrying this leaflet without weapons. You will not be harmed. You will receive food, water, and medical treatment. The final section addressed the deepest fear. What would happen after surrender? Here, Bowers drew on those months of prisoner interviews. He knew that Japanese soldiers were terrified of being paraded as defeated enemies, of being humiliated or displayed as propaganda. So the leaflets promised dignity. You will be treated according to international law. You will not be tortured or humiliated. When the war ends, you will return to Japan and to your families. Your service will be remembered with honor. That last line was carefully calculated. Not "your surrender will be forgiven," but "your service will be remembered with honor." It reframed the entire act. You weren't betraying your duty, you were fulfilling it by surviving to rebuild Japan after the war. Every word had been tested through interviews. Every phrase calibrated to address specific psychological barriers. The leaflets weren't propaganda in the traditional sense. They were permission slips. They gave soldiers a narrative that allowed them to choose life without destroying their identity. The first large-scale deployment occurred in the Philippine Highlands in June 1945. American forces had been fighting for control of these mountains for 3 months. Japanese units were dug into cave systems and bunkers, supplied by mountain trails that were nearly impossible to cut off completely. Frontal assaults were suicidal. Artillery was marginally effective against fortified positions. Progress was measured in yards per day. The leaflet drops began on June 11. B-24 bombers, which normally carried explosive payloads, instead carried bundles of paper bound with rubber bands. At altitude, bombardiers released these bundles. The rubber bands snapped as they fell, and thousands of leaflets scattered across the mountainside. American ground commanders were skeptical. One battalion commander told Bowers directly, "I've been fighting Japanese soldiers for 2 years. They don't surrender. This is a waste of time and resources." Bowers replied calmly, "Then we've lost nothing but paper. But if even 10% choose to walk out instead of dying in place, we've saved American lives." 3 days passed with no response. Then, on the morning of June 14, forward observers reported movement in the Japanese lines. Not an attack. Something stranger. Individual soldiers emerging from bunkers with white cloths tied to sticks. Others simply walking toward American positions with their hands raised, holding crumpled leaflets. The first was a private, 19 years old, skeletal from malnutrition. He approached a Marine checkpoint, trembling, leaflet held out like a talisman. The Marines, following new protocols that Bowers had insisted on, lowered their weapons. An interpreter stepped forward. "You are safe now," the interpreter said in Japanese. "No one will harm you. There is food and water. You did the right thing." The soldier collapsed, weeping. By nightfall, 37 Japanese soldiers had surrendered using the leaflets. Within 3 days that number climbed past 300. Entire defensive positions were emptying out. Some surrenders were organized, junior officers gathering their men and making collective decisions to cease resistance. Others were individuals or small groups, slipping away in darkness. The effect cascaded. Each surrender made the next more conceivable. Soldiers who'd been wavering, who'd read the leaflets but couldn't overcome their conditioning, watched others walk out and receive the promised treatment. Word spread through the Japanese positions. The Americans were keeping their promises. Surrendered soldiers were given food, medical care, and respect. This was critical. If even one surrender had gone badly, if soldiers had been mistreated or humiliated, the entire program would have collapsed. But Bowers had prepared for this. He'd briefed every American unit in the area. He'd emphasized that treating surrendered soldiers well wasn't kindness, it was strategy. Every well-treated prisoner became evidence that the leaflets were truthful. Back in his bunker, Lieutenant General Kuribayashi watched his command disintegrate. Not through military defeat but through psychological dissolution. The paper that his officers had mocked was accomplishing what American artillery could not. He understood what was happening in a way his staff did not. They saw betrayal. He saw inevitability. His soldiers weren't weak. They were making rational decisions in an impossible situation. The leaflets simply gave them language to justify those decisions to themselves. On June 18, Kuribayashi issued orders forbidding his troops from possessing the leaflets. Any soldier found with one would be executed for defection. Patrols were sent to collect and destroy them. Officers were instructed to give speeches about loyalty and honor. It was too late. The idea was already spreading. Soldiers hid the leaflets. They memorized the safe routes. They whispered to trusted comrades about the possibility of surrender. The harder Kuribayashi's officers pushed against it, the more attractive the option became. This is a fundamental principle of psychological warfare. You cannot suppress information by forbidding it. Prohibition creates curiosity. Punishment creates resentment. Kuribayashi's attempts to stop the surrenders only confirmed what the leaflets had suggested, that his soldiers were trapped in a system that valued their deaths more than their lives. By the end of June, over 1,500 Japanese soldiers had surrendered in the Highlands sector. The defensive line that American forces had been battering for months simply collapsed. Not because it was overrun but because it was abandoned. The success in the Philippines triggered a massive expansion of the leaflet campaign. Within weeks, psychological warfare units were operating across every active theater in the Pacific. The basic template remained the same, but each operation was carefully tailored to local conditions and specific enemy units. On Okinawa, where fighting was at its most intense, leaflets addressed the unique situation of Okinawan conscripts serving in Japanese units. Many of these men had been forced into service. Their loyalty to the Japanese military command was minimal. Leaflets in the Okinawan dialect emphasized that they could return to their families, that they weren't responsible for the war, that they deserved to survive it. Results varied by location and circumstance, but the overall impact was undeniable. In sectors where leaflet campaigns were conducted alongside loudspeaker broadcasts and coordinated pauses in combat to allow surrenders, the number of Japanese prisoners of war increased by over 400% compared to earlier operations. This had cascading strategic effects. Every soldier who surrendered was one fewer defender in fortified positions. Every position that was abandoned rather than assaulted meant fewer American casualties. The intelligence gathered from prisoners proved invaluable. Information about defensive layouts, supply situations, and morale that no amount of aerial reconnaissance could provide. But perhaps most importantly, the surrenders challenged American assumptions about the coming invasion of Japan. If leaflets could convince Japanese soldiers to surrender in the Philippines and Okinawa, perhaps they could do the same on the home islands. Perhaps the projected casualty rates for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, were based on flawed assumptions about enemy behavior. This possibility influenced high-level strategic thinking in ways that are still debated by historians. Some argue that the success of psychological warfare operations contributed to the decision to use atomic weapons, by suggesting that Japanese military resistance might crumble if presented with overwhelming demonstrations of American power combined with clear paths to honorable surrender. Others argue the opposite, that the leaflet campaigns demonstrated an alternative to invasion altogether, suggesting that a combination of blockade, conventional bombing and psychological operations could achieve strategic objectives without the need for a ground invasion or atomic weapons. The truth is likely more complex. But what's undeniable is that by summer 1945, psychological warfare had moved from a peripheral curiosity to a central element of American Pacific strategy. Fabian Bowers never sought credit for this work. After the war, he became a translator and cultural advisor during the American occupation of Japan. He helped preserve Japanese cultural institutions that some occupation officials wanted to dismantle. He translated classical Japanese poetry and wrote extensively about Japanese theater. When historians eventually interviewed him about the leaflet campaigns, he was characteristically modest. "I didn't invent anything," he said. "I just listened to what Japanese prisoners were already saying and gave other soldiers permission to say it too." But that framing, permission to say it, captures something profound about how the leaflets worked. They didn't create desires that didn't exist. Japanese soldiers already wanted to survive. They already recognized the war was lost. What they lacked was a framework that allowed them to act on that recognition without destroying their sense of self. The leaflets provided that framework. They created a story soldiers could tell themselves that reconciled survival with honor. And stories, as it turns out, are more powerful than physical weapons in shaping human behavior. There's a document in the National Archives, Report 47B from the Office of War Information, dated August 1945, that analyzes the effectiveness of psychological warfare operations in the Pacific. The language is bureaucratic, the tone clinical. But the numbers tell a dramatic story. In operations where leaflet campaigns were conducted, Japanese surrender rates increased by factors of 8 to 12 compared to operations without psychological warfare support. The cost-effectiveness was staggering, approximately 2,400 leaflets per surrender, at a material cost of roughly $12. Compare that to the estimated cost of artillery bombardment or air strikes needed to neutralize the same number of enemy soldiers, hundreds of thousands of dollars per casualty. But the report also includes something unusual: interviews with Japanese officers who surrendered after reading the leaflets. Their testimonies provide insight into the psychological process these pieces of paper triggered. One captain described reading a leaflet 3 times before hiding it. "I knew the information was probably true," he said through an interpreter. "The map was accurate. The promises seemed sincere. But accepting it meant admitting everything I believed about my duty was wrong. It took me 4 days to reconcile those things." Another soldier, a sergeant who surrendered with his entire squad, explained, "We talked about it at night, very quietly. We knew if the officers heard us we would be executed. But once the conversation started, it couldn't stop. The leaflet said we had already done our duty. That helped. It meant we weren't cowards for wanting to live." This process, the slow shift from reading to considering to deciding to acting, was exactly what Bowers and his team had designed for. The leaflets weren't meant to produce instant surrenders. They were meant to plant seeds of possibility that would grow over days or weeks as material conditions worsened and the military situation became increasingly hopeless. The most effective psychological warfare doesn't demand immediate behavior change. It makes future behavior change conceivable. It opens doors that previously seemed closed. Then it waits for circumstances to push people through those doors. The Japanese military command eventually recognized what was happening and attempted to counter it. New indoctrination programs emphasized the dishonor of surrender. Officers gave speeches about American brutality toward prisoners, describing fictitious tortures and humiliations. Some units instituted loyalty groups, where soldiers monitored each other for signs of defeatism. These countermeasures were largely ineffective. By attempting to suppress the idea of honorable surrender, Japanese commanders inadvertently confirmed that soldiers were considering it. By describing the leaflets as lies, they ensured that soldiers paid attention to the leaflet's content. Every attempted countermessage reinforced the original message's importance. This is a common failure in psychological operations. Trying to suppress a narrative often amplifies it. The more energy and authority expends denying something, the more people believe it must be true. Japanese commanders would have been better served by ignoring the leaflets entirely, but that option wasn't available to them. Once thousands of soldiers had surrendered citing the leaflets as justification, silence was no longer possible. There's a bitter irony here. The Japanese military's own propaganda, years of emphasizing loyalty, duty, and self-sacrifice, created the psychological framework that made the American leaflets effective. Soldiers who'd been taught that their deaths were meaningful were primed to respond to messages suggesting their survival could be honorable. The more absolute the original indoctrination, the more powerful the alternative narrative became. Bowers understood this. He wasn't fighting against Japanese military culture. He was offering a different interpretation of that culture's core values. The leaflets didn't say your beliefs are wrong. They said your beliefs can be satisfied through survival rather than death. That reframing was possible only because of how deeply those beliefs had been instilled in the first place. After the war ended in August 1945, the leaflet campaigns became a subject of intense study by military psychologists and strategists. The lessons learned influenced the development of psychological operations doctrine that remains in use today. One key insight: effective psychological warfare requires deep cultural knowledge. The leaflets worked not because they were persuasive in some universal sense, but because they were calibrated to specific Japanese cultural anxieties and values. Generic messages about self-preservation or the futility of resistance would have failed. Success required understanding how Japanese soldiers thought about duty, honor, family, and shame. This principle has obvious applications beyond warfare. Any attempt to influence behavior, marketing, public health campaigns, political messaging, succeeds or fails based on understanding the target audience's existing beliefs and finding messages that align with rather than challenge those beliefs. Another lesson: timing matters enormously. The leaflets were effective in mid-1945 because material conditions supported their message. Soldiers were starving, isolated, watching friends die of untreated wounds. The leaflets didn't create dissatisfaction. They provided language for dissatisfaction that already existed. Deployed earlier in the war, when Japanese forces were well supplied and experiencing military success, the same leaflets would have been dismissed as desperate propaganda. Psychological warfare is most effective not as a primary weapon but as an accelerant for conditions created by conventional operations. The blockade, the air campaigns, the grinding attrition. These created the circumstances where surrender became conceivable. The leaflets simply made that conceivability explicit. There's a photograph in the U.S. National Archives that captures something essential about this story. Taken in July 1945, it shows a group of Japanese soldiers who surrendered in the Philippines sitting in a temporary holding area. They're eating rice balls and drinking water. Some are receiving medical treatment for wounds and infections. In the foreground, one soldier holds a leaflet, smoothing it flat with both hands. His expression is difficult to read, relief, perhaps, mixed with uncertainty. The caption identifies him as Private Hiroshi Tanaka, age 22. He surrendered along with 17 members of his unit after their position ran out of food and ammunition. According to interview records, Tanaka kept that leaflet for the rest of his life. When historians contacted him in the 1980s, he still had it, carefully preserved in a wooden box. Asked why, he said, "Because it saved my life. Because it told me I could choose to live without being ashamed. That piece of paper was more powerful than any weapon I faced in the war." That testimony captures the fundamental strangeness of psychological warfare. A piece of paper, ink and cellulose, information and narrative, can alter human behavior more effectively than explosives or bullets. Not through physical coercion but through changing how people understand their choices. This is both encouraging and unsettling. Encouraging because it suggests that conflicts can be resolved without maximizing physical destruction. Unsettling because it reveals how malleable human decision-making is, how susceptible we all are to messages that align with our existing anxieties and desires. The leaflet campaigns in the Pacific represent a turning point in how militaries understood warfare. Prior to this, psychological operations were largely peripheral, propaganda meant to demoralize civilian populations or boost friendly morale. The idea that you could use information to directly disable enemy military units, to render them non-functional without destroying them, was relatively new. After 1945, this became central to military doctrine. The Cold War saw massive investments in psychological operations capabilities. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, and later electronic media were employed in conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan. The specific tactics evolved with technology, but the underlying principle remained. Understand what your enemy fears, desires, and believes, then craft messages that exploit that understanding. The ethics of this approach are complex. On one hand, psychological warfare that convinces enemies to surrender rather than fight reduces casualties on both sides. It's arguably more humane than conventional combat. On the other hand, it represents sophisticated manipulation of human psychology, deliberate exploitation of fear and cultural conditioning. Bowers himself wrestled with this tension. In a 1963 interview he reflected, "I helped end combat without additional killing. That seems good. but I did it by exploiting desperate men's fears and cultural shame. That seems less good. I've never fully reconciled those things. That inability to fully reconcile the moral dimensions of psychological warfare is, perhaps, the appropriate response. Any tool powerful enough to end battles without violence is powerful enough to manipulate and coerce in concerning ways. The fact that it was used in service of ending World War II doesn't resolve the broader ethical questions about when and how such tools should be employed. In the decades after the war, Japan's relationship with the surrender issue evolved significantly. Initially, returning soldiers who'd surrendered faced stigma and social isolation. Families were ashamed. Employment opportunities were limited. The cultural weight of having chosen life over death remained heavy. But gradually, as Japanese society reckoned with the war's legacy, attitudes shifted. By the 1970s and 80s, surviving veterans, including those who'd surrendered, were increasingly seen as victims of militaristic leadership rather than as individuals who'd failed their duty. The men who'd walked out of the Philippine highlands with leaflets in hand were no longer pariahs but survivors of a catastrophic national mistake. This shift was partly enabled by the very arguments the American leaflets had made. The framing that surrender was a rational response to impossible circumstances, that survival was honorable when continued resistance was futile. These ideas eventually became part of Japan's post-war historical narrative. In that sense, the leaflet's psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate military objective. They helped create a conceptual framework that allowed an entire society to process collective trauma without glorifying militaristic self-destruction. Today, the leaflets themselves are museum pieces. The Psychological Warfare collection at the National Archives contains thousands of examples, preserved in acid-free folders. They're fragile now, the paper yellowing, the ink fading. But the ideas they carried remain relevant. Modern military operations still employ psychological warfare, though the tools have changed. Social media, text messages, radio broadcasts, and targeted online advertising have replaced paper leaflets. But the underlying principle endures. Understand what motivates your enemy, then craft messages that exploit that understanding to achieve strategic objectives without maximizing violence. The leaflets that fell on the Philippine highlands in 1945 represented one of the first systematic applications of behavioral psychology to military operations. They proved that if you understand human psychology deeply enough, you can change outcomes without changing physical reality, just by changing how people interpret that reality. That's a profound and somewhat unsettling discovery. It suggests that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with words, with narratives, with carefully crafted stories that give people permission to choose differently than they otherwise would. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in August 1945 after the Emperor's radio broadcast announcing Japan's capitulation. In his final report to High Command, written just before his surrender, he included a section on the leaflet campaigns. "The enemy understood something we did not," he wrote. "That our soldiers' loyalty was never in question, but their will to die was not infinite. By offering an alternative that preserved honor while acknowledging reality, they gave our men permission to make rational choices. We could not counter this because our only response was to demand greater irrationality. In that contest we were always going to lose." That assessment, from a general who'd fought against psychological warfare operations, represents perhaps the most honest evaluation of their effectiveness. The leaflets worked not because they were propagandistic lies but because they were more truthful than the narratives Japanese soldiers were being told by their own command. When your enemy's propaganda is more honest than your official communications, you've already lost the psychological battle. If there's a final lesson in this story, it's about the nature of power and persuasion. We tend to think of warfare in terms of physical dominance, who has more weapons, better technology, stronger forces. But human conflicts are fundamentally psychological. Armies don't fight because of material factors alone. They fight because individuals choose to fight, because they believe in their cause or fear the consequences of not fighting, or simply because they don't see alternatives. Change what people believe and you change what they do. Give them alternatives they can accept, and some percentage will take those alternatives regardless of their prior commitment. The leaflets that Japanese generals laughed at weren't military weapons in the traditional sense. They were cognitive tools. Instruments designed not to destroy but to transform, to shift perception, to reframe choices, to make the previously unthinkable suddenly conceivable. And in that transformation lay their power. 3 inches by 5 inches. Black ink on white paper. Less than a gram. But inside that small, light rectangle was something heavier than artillery shells and more devastating than bombs. The possibility of choice. The recognition that you could lay down your weapon, walk toward the enemy, and live. For 1,500 Japanese soldiers in the summer of 1945, that possibility was everything. It was the difference between death in a mountain bunker and survival to rebuild a broken world. Between martyrdom and memory. Between the end of a story and its continuation. The generals laughed at the leaflets because they saw only paper. They missed what was written on that paper: permission. And permission, as it turns out, is the most powerful weapon of all. Because it's the only weapon that transforms enemies into survivors without anyone having to die.